Okay, so we pick up today where we left off yesterday, and it's good that we didn't get to Maimonides, because Maimonides and Spinoza form a pair. Spinoza is constantly arguing with Maimonides. His arguments are overt. That is, he mentions Maimonides, tells us uncharitably why Maimonides is wrong. He rejects Maimonides' way of reading the Bible, Maimonides' way of thought. On the other hand, there's tremendous agreement between Spinoza and Maimonides, despite these differences. For our purposes, we can leave the metaphysics aside and just focus on the political content. And both of these thinkers have what I would call a strong political reading of Judaism. They really see Judaism as culminating in a kind of political order. That's the point. The Torah is a constitution. What they mean by that is quite different, but they agree on the fundamental point that the Torah is about politics. There's no gap between what we might call religion and what we might call politics. So first of all, let's look at Maimonides. Maimonides is the leading intellectual figure of the Middle Ages for Jews. His dates are 1135 to 1204. 1135 to 1204. He was born in Spain. He and his family had to flee Cordova, Spain, and Spain at the time had been invaded by people who today, anachronistically, we probably call Islamicists, Islamic fundamentalists, jihadis. I don't know what the exact anachronistic term is, but people who were so religiously passionate that they would not tolerate anyone who was not like themselves. So as they came to Spain, others were pushed out, more tolerant Muslims, Jews. The Maimon family fled across North Africa. They briefly went to the land of Israel. Then they settled in Old Cairo in Egypt. And Maimonides rose to great prominence there as the head of the Jewish community, as well as the doctor, the physician to the Sultan. Maimonides, for our purposes, wrote two important books. He wrote more than two, but what concerns us, the excerpts you have, are two of his books. The first book is called the Mishneh Torah. Mishneh Torah, and this comes out, he's writing it between 1170 and 1180. The importance of the Mishneh Torah, it's also, by the way, called Yad HaChazakah, which means a strong hand. So Mishneh Torah means repetition of the Torah, and Yad HaChazakah means strong hand. And the reason it's called the Yad is because it contains 14 volumes, 14 collections of books. And in Hebrew, you represent the number 14 with a yud and a daled. So you have the opportunity for a little pun. You can either say, the 14 books, really 14 volumes that each contain a number of books. You could treat it as a word, and yad is also the word for hand, so strong hand. So it's a little insider joke, rabbinic humor. Okay, so the Mishnah Torah is an extremely important book in Judaism because it's the first systematic code of all of Jewish law. Before Maimonides, there were some attempts to take some of the law that was practiced from the Talmud as understood by subsequent generations of Jewish deciders of law, poskim. Maimonides was the first one who took the entirety of Jewish law and tried to synthesize it into a gigantic encyclopedia. And what Maimonides did was he took all of the law that no longer applied, everything concerning sacrifices, everything concerning pure and impure, everything concerning agriculture, everything concerning the priests, all of these vast fields of Jewish law rooted in the Bible that had no application whatsoever because there was no more temple. Without the sacrificial system, all of this is simply suspended. But Maimonides codified all of it. So to this day, it's the only fully comprehensive code of Jewish law. Now, why is this important for our purposes? Because Maimonides envisions his code not just as something that's relevant, that applies today, at least those portions that would apply today in his time, but he envisioned the whole thing as sort of the law of the Jewish people in the time of the Messiah. So he envisioned an entire system, completely comprehensive. Divisions we might use today, like ritual law, civil law, criminal law, constitutional law, all of these fields that would comprise not only any actual legal system, but something with a great deal of religion added to it as well. Maimonides wanted to present the whole thing in a systematic way as a projection of what a future Jewish state would look like, of how a future Jewish state would live when it's governed by a messianic king, and when the temple is rebuilt, and when there are sacrifices once again. So it's very much the idea of the Torah as a constitution of a full-blown, total, restored Jewish polity, Jewish political society. The last book, or the last division of the Mishnah Torah, from which we have one of our readings, is called Hilchot Melachim U'Milchamotehem, which means the laws of kings and their wars. That's very interesting. In his view of the Messianic age, it's not a time when the lion will lie down with the lamb and everyone will get along. There will be wars. And there's a way for the Messianic king and his armies to conduct wars. So that's part of this political story of the Messianic age. Maimonides tells us that there's no difference between Yemot HaMashiach, the Messianic age, and our time, history, except that Israel will live in its land and it will be secure. So it is not a full-blown utopian vision of a Messianic age. It's a very political vision of a Messianic age, with restored Jewish sovereignty in the land, an army, real political rule. Okay, so I hope that little sketch is enough to give you a basic idea. But let's look at some of the texts. So we have some excerpts in this translation. So it's Kings and Wars, the bottom of page 215, chapter 1. 3 commandments to be carried out on entering the land of Israel were enjoined upon, were commanded to Israel. 1, to appoint a king, as it is said, and then he quotes the verse that we studied yesterday, you shall appoint a king over you. If you don't know what the word in this translation means, you shall in any wise set him king over you, I can't help you because I don't know what it means either. It's archaic English and we can just ignore it. So the first commandment that Israel is given to apply when they enter the land is to set a king over them. Secondly, to destroy the seed of Amalek, this enemy that attacked Israel in the wilderness. You shall blot out the remembrance of Amalek. And finally, to build the temple, to build the sanctuary. And there's another quote for that. Among these reasons, the appointment of a king was to precede the war with Amalek. The Lord gives a quote from Samuel. The destruction of the seed of Amalek was to precede the erection of the sanctuary. There's another proof text. Seeing that the setting up of a king was a commandment, why did the Holy One, blessed be he, look with disfavor upon the request made by the people of Samuel for a king? The other text that we read yesterday, God commanded, Som Plasim Alapamelech, to set up a king over yourselves. Why was God upset when the people asked Samuel for this? Basically because they asked it in a bad spirit. They asked it, they were not grateful, they were combative, they were aggressive, querulous spirit. Their request was prompted not by the desire to fulfill a commandment, but by a desire to rid themselves of Samuel the prophet. So Maimonides is saying, it's certainly a mitzvah, it's certainly a commandment to appoint a king. We shouldn't infer that it's not a commandment because God was angry about it. God was only angry about it because they didn't ask it l'shem mitzvah. They didn't ask it for the sake of doing a commandment. They asked it because they wanted to get rid of Samuel. Their motivation was bad. So in Maimonides' reading of that commandment in Deuteronomy, there's no doubt that it is a commandment. It's not simply a reshut, a permission. It's an order. It's something you have to do. And from his point of view, without a king to rule the Israelites, you can't do any of these other things. You can't clear the land of its enemy. You can't set up the temple for proper worship of God. So Maimonides is a strong monarchist. The case I'm making is that he goes beyond being merely strongly in favor of monarchy. He sees Judaism fundamentally as a politics. He's fundamentally a political philosopher. So I just maybe look at one more section of the Mishnah Torah. Take a look at the next page. It says chapter 3. Does everyone have this? As soon as the king ascends the throne, he must write a scroll of the law for himself, in addition to the one which his ancestors had left him. He is to have it corrected by the court of 71 from the scroll in the temple court. And then he has some other restrictions on the king. The king is forbidden to drink to the point of intoxication. So too, he must not indulge in sexual excess. Basically, what Maimonides is trying to do is to hold the king accountable to the law. There's an argument in the Talmud whether the king is in a sense above the law, whether he's answerable to the law. How far does the mishpat hamelech, the power of the king, run? Maimonides' move is to constitutionalize kingship, to try to bring the king under the control, at least the level of the king's own conscience, under the control of the Torah. He has to have the Sefer Torah, the scroll of the Torah. He needs to write it for himself or hire a scribe to write it. He needs to keep it with him at all times. So it's an attempt to curb or to control, to pull in the power of the king. And he goes on talking about the various powers and restrictions on kingship. But let's leave that where it is and go on to, for our purposes, maybe the more important text, which is the Guide for the Perplexed. So, this is the most powerful work of philosophy, expression of Jewish rationalist philosophy to come out of the Middle Ages, probably the most important work of Jewish philosophy ever. The Guide for the Perplexed appeared in 1190. It was written in Arabic. The Mishnah Torah, by the way, was written in Hebrew. The Guide for the Perplexed was being translated into Hebrew in the year Maimonides died, 1204. He corresponded with the rabbi in Provence in southern France who was translating the guide. There's a letter, exchange of letters that we have. I don't know if any of you have tried to study the Guide for the Perplexed. And I'll just tell you a few things about it before we get to the text itself. He had a student named Joseph who came to Egypt from Baghdad in Iraq to study with him. And Joseph was a rabbi, so he was learned in Jewish law, but he also was trying to be a philosopher. So he had studied science, as we would say, metaphysics, ethics. Basically, the curriculum for a philosopher in those days was Aristotle. Not so much Aristotle on his own, but Aristotle through the lens of Muslim scholars, Muslim philosophers who studied Aristotle. Joseph is perplexed, which is to say confused. Doesn't know how to think clearly in reconciling Aristotle and the Aristotelian Weltanschauung, the Aristotelian worldview, science, with Torah. He has a problem. He wants to be a pious man. He's a rabbi. On the other hand, he's bitten off a big bite of this apple, Aristotelianism, and he can't put them together. What are some of the conflicts between the two? Probably the most important conflict is that the Torah gives us a story in the first two chapters of the first book, Bereshit, Genesis, in which God creates the world. Yesh me ayin. Something comes out of nothing, it seems. Or maybe something comes out of some unformed something. At any rate, there's God. God does something, and an ordered universe emerges. Does Aristotle believe this story? No. Aristotle doesn't know anything about this. For Aristotle, the world is eternal. For Aristotle, it's absolutely senseless, for a lot of reasons, to think that something can come out of nothing. The world has to be eternal, parte ante, that is going back to all eternity. So this is a big problem. Aristotelian physics, Aristotelian science, the whole outlook of his philosophical mentality depends on a kind of orderly cosmos that has always been. This is a big difference. So how can you be a contemporary, good 12th century scientist in good intellectual standing in a sophisticated world and believe in the Torah at the same time? That's a problem. And Rabbi Joseph has an additional problem, and that is his father is sick, and he has to go back to Iraq to care for him. So he has to cut his studies with Maimonides, Moshe ibn Maimun, we call him Maimonides. He has to go back to Baghdad, and without completing his course of study, he can't overcome his perplexity. So Maimonides writes him and others like him, he says, a letter. And the Guide to the Perplexed is written in the form of a letter. Now, Maimonides has a problem. The problem is that to discuss the origins of the world, which the Jewish tradition before Maimonides calls Ma'aseh Bereshit, the work of creation, and to discuss the destiny of the world, the Ma'aseh Merkavah, metaphysics. These are forbidden topics. The Talmudic tradition is you don't discuss these things in public. They're dangerous. They are sitrei Torah, secrets of the Torah. You shouldn't talk about them except with disciples you can trust. If you tell this to ordinary people, it's too much for them to handle, and they're going to have a lot of problems. They may lose their faith, they may stop practicing. Bad stuff can occur. So Maimonides has a problem. To write a book, manuscript, is a public act. People can get hold of it, they can read it, and then he will have violated the halakha of not talking about these subjects in public. On the other hand, he can't talk to Joseph face to face, he has to write something. So he writes the Guide for the Perplexed in such a way that it has an external or exoteric layer that anybody can read. It has a deep layer, an esoteric layer, that has his true views, what he sees as the real heart of the matter. But to get to the true views, you have to overcome all of the traps that he lays for you on the exoteric, on the superficial level. He tells us in the introduction, he's going to contradict himself, he's going to have a discussion, and then he's going to break it off, and then it's going to reappear at another point in the book. And unless you're really patient and you have a good memory, you won't be able to pull these two things together. So the book is set up to some degree as a secret teaching hidden behind puzzles. What does Maimonides himself really believe? That's unclear. In the century after he wrote the book, it was burned in France. There were, for over 100 years, 4 big explosions of anger, of organized condemnation, not just against the Guide, but also against the Mishnah Torah. In a way, this controversy, even though it's part of the medieval Jewish history in Europe, in a way it's never really ended. I mean, the story is really about, does philosophy belong in Judaism? Can rabbinic Judaism live with philosophy, or is philosophy fundamentally subversive does it undermine Judaism? If you follow Maimonides like I do, of course philosophy doesn't undermine Judaism. Philosophy brings Judaism to a higher level, helps perfect Judaism. It makes Judaism something that reason can consent to or can celebrate. It's not just blind faith. If you're anti-Maimonidean, you say, oh, horrible. Anyway, just a little background on the guide. But the guide is, in a way, a very politically oriented book for all of the metaphysics and the interpretation and how you should read the Bible, hermeneutics, we call it. It has a very strong political teaching. And one of the places where that emerges is here in chapter 40. You have the text. The guide is divided into 3 books. This is the middle book, book 2. So, Maimonides tells us, I think, coming from what he knows of Aristotle, or you could get this from Plato as well, it has been explained with utmost clarity that man is political by nature, and that it is his nature to live in society. So Aristotle begins the politics with, the famous line that human beings, anthropoi, are by nature political beings, political animals, zoon politikon. Maimonides is channeling this common wisdom. We need to live in society, but he tells us that unlike other social animals, like dogs, wolves, birds, Aristotle also makes this point. There are other social species. We're not the only social species, obviously. But Aristotle says, what's the difference between other social species, like bees, and human beings? And for Aristotle, the answer is only human beings ask the question, what is justice? Human beings can think about what it means to be a social species and how they should live. Other species just do it. They don't have the cognitive equipment to ask those kinds of questions. So human beings have a language in which they can raise the question of what is the good life together. Maimonides goes on to give his version of the good life. He says that unlike other species, we are individuals. We are so constituted that we like different things, we're good at different things, we have different strengths, different weaknesses, and this is a very Platonic way of thinking. What society does is it organizes a division of labor in which we can become civilized because we rely on each other to do the things that each one is good at, and therefore together we strengthen each other. If we each had to do everything on our own, it would be terrible. We would never be able to achieve a fully human way of life, which requires this kind of creative, fertilizing dependence on one another. So Maimonides lays out that case. And he then goes on and makes a particular point about what kind of society best allows human beings, in all of their differences, but their need for one another, to live. And he says in the next page, 382, now as the nature of the human species requires that there be those differences among the individuals belonging to it, and as, in addition, society is a necessity for this nature, it is by no means possible that his society should be perfected except, and this is necessarily so, through a ruler who gauges the actions of the individuals, perfecting that which is deficient and reducing that which is excessive, and who prescribes actions and moral habits that all of them must always practice in the same way, so that the natural diversity is hidden through the multiple points of conventional accord, and so that the community becomes well ordered. So Maimonides is not a believer in like spontaneous order. He's not an anarchist. He doesn't think that if we didn't have government, we could just all figure out how to work together and come up with a way in which my weakness is balanced by your strength, your weakness by my strength. We trade freely, a sort of Friedrich von Hayek view of the world, Milton Friedman, Adam Smith kind of view. Now, for Maimonides, you need a wise ruler who understands that despite human diversity, individuality, there has to be commonality. There has to be a basis, a law that all share in order to order these interests. So he sees a need for some sort of strong central principle of order, strong central government, king, to impose law which allows for the flourishing of all of the individuals. This is exactly what Bravenel was opposed to. We saw yesterday. Therefore I say, this is an often quoted sentence of Maimonides, therefore I say that the law, although it is not natural, enters into what is natural. It is a part of the wisdom of the deity, of God, with regard to the permanence of this species, which he has willed into existence, that he put into its nature that individuals belonging to it should have the faculty of ruling. So Maimonides is doing something very subtle here. He's saying that up until now he's given, he's not talking like a Jewish theologian. He's not doing theology. He's talking as a philosopher, and his mode of philosophizing is naturalistic. He's giving us what we call a philosophical anthropology. That is, he's giving us a doctrine of human nature, a philosophical story about who, what human beings are, in order to support theory, a philosophical theory about how human beings should live. Philosophical anthropology is the jargon term for this. Or as Kant would put it, philosophische Anthropologie. That's what Kant taught at the University of Königsberg. He didn't teach his own stuff. He taught what they called anthropology back in the 18th century. Okay, so it's very naturalistic, right? There's nothing particularly theological about this. But then he says, but we have a Torah. And the Torah is not natural. It comes from God, beyond nature, but it enters into nature. And the Torah and nature work together to bring about an ideal society in which at least Jewish human beings can flourish. So this is Maimonides, the philosopher, not the theologian who uses a bit of philosophy, but really a philosopher also rooted in Torah. And within their medieval world, they distinguish between what in Arabic they call kalam, which is theology that uses some philosophy, and really philosophy, which was much more Aristotelian. So, yes, sir.
Little question. How do you think has the Islam influence on Maimonides or the Jewish philosophy or political thought?
Completely.
Because this spiritual, esoteric meaning is also maybe come from Islam or
Did come from Islam.
maybe Sufism and other biblical.
Yeah, Maimonides never talks about his Jewish predecessors, people like Sa'adi Gaon, Isaac Israeli. He has no regard for Jewish intellectuals before his own work, but he's always talking about Avicenna, Ibn Sina, talks about Al-Farabi, others. His contemporary Ibn Rushd, they were born in the same city in Spain. There are many, many parallels between Maimonides and Averroes, including the secrecy theme, that you can't talk about this in public. So there's no doubt that to really understand Maimonides, you have to understand the Islamic philosophical world that he's coming from. I mean, he's speaking their language, literally and metaphorically. He's using Arabic philosophical terms. I'm not enough of a specialist to be able to say anything about the important differences between them. I think that's part of the ongoing controversy about Maimonides. For example, in the Muslim philosophers, there's this theme that you also can't talk about these things in front of the masses. It's not for them, and there's sort of two truths going on. There's the real ultimate truth, which is hidden, and then there's the superficial truth that people live by. And the purpose of the superficial truth is social order. It's politics, really. It's to keep the state going. Is that Maimonides' view? Well, it sounds like that a lot. That's, this is very political reading, but it's a question of how far to push that. So, anyway, what Maimonides then gives us here is some thinking about what is the difference between the Torah's law and the society, the political ideal, the ideal polity, the ideal commonwealth that the Torah has in mind. What's the difference between that and ordinary law? Where does the natural end in a political order, and when does the supernatural, the divine, begin? So clearly there's a natural kind of spontaneous political order that human societies have had that does not require direct divine input. So Maimonides calls the kind of community, he calls attention to the community that lives under a natural law that all human beings have. And he refers to this law as nomoi, not a Greek word for law. I think it's nimus in the Arabic. He says that the purpose of the natural law of the nomos is basically the health of the body, the security of property, things we expect from a modern secular state. Modern secular state isn't very worried about what you believe. It doesn't care about the salvation of your soul. Its purpose is a very worldly purpose of making life possible without constant fear of crime and violence, providing the kind of services that let people have enough to eat and drink and have safety and so on. So he says that's human, that's the nomos. But clearly Jews and Muslims have something in addition to that. They have this Torah, or usually uses the word Sharia, law. They have this divine law that comes from God, and that has a different purpose. That has the practical worldly purpose of creating a kind of good society in the basic physical, material well-being sense. It has the additional purpose of perfecting the soul. So for him, it's health of body and also health of soul. So the best society cares about both. The society of the Torah wants to perfect your body, to enable you to live a good, flourishing life of human well-being. It also wants to go beyond that and create a kind of circumstance in which you can achieve intellectual perfection, which unfortunately almost nobody can do. Maimonides will restrict that to very, very, very few. But the highest intellectual perfection a human being can achieve is to know God, to love God, and imitate God. And the guide for the perplexed, the Morenda Ruchim, is ultimately its teaching is how to know God, how to love God, and how to live in imitation of God, imitatio Dei. V'halachta bidrachav. You shall walk in God's ways. And he goes on in this chapter, if you've read it, he says, well, the only way we can get to that higher kind of knowledge is through prophecy. But everybody's got a prophet. The Muslims have a prophet, Christians have a prophet, the Jews have a prophet. Moses, obviously Moses is the greatest of the prophets. Maimonides, that's self-evident. So he needs to introduce criteria for how to distinguish between true prophecy, false prophecy, failed prophecy. It's highly self-interested, to put it mildly. But that's the basic political teaching here, that Judaism, the Torah, has as its aim the perfect society in which human beings can maximally flourish to the extent that their intellectual capacity allows them to develop and to have their minds so perfected that they come to commune, cling to the mind of God, and there's an intellectual apprehension of divinity that comes in a kind of mystical flash. That's the highest. And you can't get there without politics, and that in a way is what politics is for, to bring human beings to perfection. So it's a kind of comprehensive package of the portrayal of human nature, Judaism, all under this kind of political sign of what the perfect state would be.
Maybe the goal of salvation in Judaism is maybe to bring the people to some ideal form of political order or some ideal form of social life, as I understood, yes.
Yeah, definitely. Now, let me complicate things since you asked. Make it a little bit more complicated. And I think here's the place before we get to Spinoza where Maimonides' authentic Jewish teaching comes out and where he parts ways with the Greek teaching, maybe. So, if ultimately the purpose of the Torah is to create a good political society in which individuals can reach perfection, does that mean that ultimately perfection is post-political? That is, politics is like a ladder. When you get to the top of the ladder and you've gotten to the next story, or the last story where you need to be, and you kick the ladder behind, and you're there. Is that what it's about? Or does somehow the political shape of the whole remain? Has anyone ever read the philosopher Wittgenstein? Great Viennese philosopher, goes to England. You read?
Are you talking about Ludwig Wittgenstein?
What?
Are you talking about Ludwig Wittgenstein?
The one and only, yeah, Ludwig Wittgenstein. So Wittgenstein said, my philosophy is a ladder, and when you've climbed it, you can kick the ladder behind. And I was in Cambridge a few years ago for a conference. And before the conference began, I walked up the hill to the cemetery where Wittgenstein is buried. Because I love Wittgenstein. I wanted to go to his grave. And there are all of these little plastic ladders at his grave. This is very fun. So what is Maimonides' teaching? Is Judaism, in a way, beyond politics? You need this holy, constitutional, political Judaism to get to the top, and then you don't need it anymore. So is the Torah's ideal a solitary individual who lives in pure contemplation, overcomes his political nature, doesn't need other people? Is that what it's about? Maimonides seems to say so. At the end of the God, he basically tells us in Book 3, chapter 51, he says that the purpose of the commandments, the whole Jewish way of life in society, is to reach beyond the commandments into a communion with God, into a kind of intellectual veikut, a clinging to God. And he strongly suggests that the commandments all have a purpose, and the purpose is a way to outgrow them, to get on to something purely philosophical. I think he has an argument for this, but he comes back then at the end of the book, a couple of chapters later, and he basically says, no. Life is with people. And ultimately, we can't know God. We can't know God in a positive sense. We can't know who or what God is. We can only know what God is not. God is not a being whom we can describe or characterize or know in any positive sense. We can only know about things that are not God. Therefore, we have to be scientists of this world, because this world is not God. What we can do is imitate what we understand to be God's ways. And it's through the imitation of God that we can understand as much as the human mind can understand of God. And the imitation of God does require other people. It requires being kind. It requires being generous. It requires being just. It requires being able to live in society, to rule, to be ruled. So it comes back in a way from this kind of almost Platonic getting out of the cave to going back in the cave, so to speak, and living with other human beings. So it's a very Jewish view, I would say. Okay, any questions about Maimonides before we move on to the next great Jewish rationalist?
What influence has Maimonides on the development of Kabbalah or maybe spiritual part of Judaism?
That's an interesting question. The question is, what is the influence of Maimonides on the form of Jewish mysticism called Kabbalah that starts to develop around the same time in southern France and Spain? Some see Maimonides and his kind of philosophy as a way of fighting the tendencies that become Kabbalah. As before there's full-blown Kabbalah in the Zohar, which comes in the 13th century, Maimonides is already dead by the beginning of the 13th century. What emerges as Sefer Zohar and Kabbalah, Maimonides is already kind of knowing that's out there, and he's fighting it through the sort of theology or philosophy he has in God for the lives. Some see Kabbalah as a response to Maimonides, a way of fighting Maimonides. So Maimonides, I don't think, contributes to Kabbalah in a positive way. There's a struggle going on, depending on how we date it, but Maimonides' views are very, very different from Kabbalah. I think the only thing that Maimonides and Kabbalah have in common is that they have a common origins in Neoplatonism. Yes, Maimonides is very Aristotelian, but he's also very Neoplatonist. And Kabbalah is very Neoplatonist. So. Okay, any questions about the political vision of Maimonides and his highly political reading of the purpose of the Torah? Okay. It pleases me greatly to be 100% understood. My wife and children don't understand me 100%. So how pleasant it is to come to Kiev. Good. Okay. Let's think about Spinoza. And okay, so Benedict Spinoza, 1632 to 1677. So what? He was only 45 years old when he died. When Spinoza was my age, he'd already been dead for 20 years. What do we know about Spinoza? Have any of you read Spinoza before, studied him? Okay, great. I think what most people know about Spinoza is that his family came from Portugal. They were so-called Moranos or conversos, the better term, or anusim in Hebrew. That is, these were Jews who were compelled to become Catholic in the persecutions a couple of hundred years before. And when they had the opportunity, when the Netherlands became a free country, they moved to the Netherlands, and then they had been Jews secretly, and then they were able to express their Judaism freely once again. So there was a growing community of Spanish and Portuguese Jews in Amsterdam. Spinoza was born in Amsterdam. They're not completely free, they were tolerated. The Dutch were pretty tolerant, but they lived under all kinds of restrictions. And one of the restrictions was that the community had to really police itself and not cause any trouble. So one of the struggles that the community had was with people who didn't behave. It's easy enough if people didn't behave in criminal ways, but it gets a little trickier when people dissent from the Judaism of the rabbis and the schools that they had there. And there were a number of people before Spinoza who had a hard time accepting the traditional Jewish belief of the community. The community was very vigilant, very focused and concerned that everyone should think the same way and have something like an orthodox understanding of Judaism. If you got out of line, if you didn't behave physically or intellectually, then the community could ban you, B-A-N, ban, or cherem in Hebrew. And a cherem also is excommunication. To be banned or excommunicated is excluded from the community. The community, no one can talk to you, no one can do business with you, even your own family. So there were some people who were banned for reasons of heresy. They weren't sufficiently orthodox for the community, and typically they would recant, they would say, "I'm sorry," and then they'd be accepted back. The young Spinoza was banned. We don't know why. We have the record of the ban, but the ban doesn't tell us exactly what he believed and taught, what his sin was. It just talks about him in really insulting language as a dangerous person. Well, sort of Socrates, corrupting the youth. I think they probably expected that Spinoza would do what Uriel Acosta and others did, which is to say, "I'm sorry, I'll never do this again, please let me back in." He would come back in, everything would be fine. He didn't do that. He was a man of integrity. He was wholehearted, and he believed what he believed, whatever that was at the time. He was, I think, 22 or something like that when he was banned. And he never went back to the Jewish community. His name was Baruch, blessed. Changed his name to Benedictus, blessed. He moved to Den Haag, The Hague. Spinoza, yes?
He was banned, he was excused for corrupting the youth. It's the main version, or?
They didn't use that expression in the cherem, in the writ of excommunication. I'm just comparing him to Socrates.
You mean?
Yeah. No, we don't know why he was banned. It doesn't say. It just talks about his monstrous deeds and just all kinds of flowery, extreme language. But clearly he had some beliefs that were at great variance with rabbinic Judaism. So the temptation is to read the book from which you read a chapter, the Treatise Theological-Politicus, the Theological-Political tractate, or from his posthumous book, The Ethics. And indeed, those views are totally heretical from a traditional Jewish point of view, but these books were written, close to his death, so we don't quite know what his beliefs were in his 20s when he was banned. But they must have been very upsetting to his teachers, because he was a brilliant young man, and it must have been a gigantic disappointment to them. I'm sure they saw him as a great future rabbi of the community, but he turned out to be the greatest heretic. Spinoza is often called the last medieval Jew and the first modern Jew. He occupies a place somewhere between the medieval Jewish experience and the modern Jewish experience, in the sense that if you were excommunicated from the Jewish community let's say a couple of hundred years before Spinoza, and you lived in Europe, I think you basically had two choices: become a Christian or die. I mean, there's no place to live. There's no sphere between Christianity and Judaism. What would you do? You can't live as a solitary individual. There's no notion of the secular in the modern sense. But Spinoza does not become a Christian. And there are enough Freidenker, there are enough free thinkers, there's enough intellectual ferment in the Netherlands so that he found friends. He lived with a Christian family. He made his living grinding lenses. I guess we'd call him an optician today. He made lenses, glasses. So Spinoza is a kind of prophet of a secular, democratic, modern world that hasn't come into being yet, but he's living as if there were such a place. And his main political work, the Theological-Political tractate, is a kind of argument for the ideal society as a secular, republic, democratic, kind of commercial society in which people leave religion alone. They put it behind them. They keep it very minimal. And yet Spinoza is, in a sense, still a medieval or a Reformation kind of character, that he's very much involved in religion. In order to make the argument for a sort of secular, modern, political vision, you have to do it through reading the Bible and through making a critique of the Bible. So the reason this is called a theological-political tractate rather than just a political tractate is because he needs to see his vision as, in a sense, the esoteric, the hidden truth of the Bible. Very Maimonidean, there's a hidden esoteric truth of the Bible, and it has to do with how people live together in political society. On the other hand, he wants to fight hard against people like Maimonides or Christian thinkers by saying that the Bible is not a source of knowledge. The Bible does not teach us any intellectual, scientific, philosophical truths. The Bible at most teaches us moral truths, very simple beliefs. There's a God, obey him by loving one another. That's basically it. All of the stories of the Bible are meant for simple people to give them vivid lessons and examples of what to do right, of what to do wrong. The prophets, unlike Maimonides, are not, the complete philosophers who achieve a kind of intellectual bond with God. The prophets are just really imaginative people who figured out how to be leaders of their societies through teaching the people simple truths. And Spinoza's project in this book is, particularly in this chapter, I should say, is to present Moses as a very savvy, very smart, very effective prophet. That doesn't mean he has any intellectual powers. It doesn't mean he had any true religious experience. It just means he's figured out how to make people obey. The whole purpose of Judaism, as it's presented in the Bible, all of the ritual laws, all of those commandments, is to give people a kind of society in which they have buy-in, in which they can feel at home, in which they obey the law. after the destruction of the society, the Torah goes down the drain. There's no reason for a Torah anymore. Nothing remains except the moral core. And the moral core, belief in God, doing good, not harming one another, trying to love one another, that remains. You don't need the Old Testament to teach you that. But if you have the Old Testament, okay, that's fine. But nothing of what the Jews continue to practice really remains in force. It's like following the laws of a state that no longer exists. It's a totally worldly, materialistic, 100% political version of Judaism. Judaism was simply sort of Emil Durkheim with a sword. You know, it was just a kind of sociology to bring people together around a set of common practices and laws. Cynical, in a way. That is Spinoza's rather bleak vision. And this is the chapter in which he has to try to argue for that on the grounds of the Bible itself, which you can imagine is very hard to do, since there's so much in the Bible that implies the eternity of the Torah, the eternity of Am Yisrael, of the Jewish people, the will of God embedded in these commandments. Spinoza doesn't want to read it that way. So Spinoza is one of the inventors of what, for the past 150 years or so, has been called Bible criticism, or biblical criticism. Spinoza's view is not that God gave the Torah all on Mount Sinai so much, is that a human editor, Ezra, put different inherited traditions together into a book. So it's a way of making the Torah a very worldly document. Now, he does think that there was Moses, and that Moses is a lawgiver, and that Moses gave a law that brought his people to obey him for good reasons. So here's Spinoza's reasoning. He says that people often obey law out of fear. They're afraid of what will happen to them if they break the law. But the most effective law is not followed out of fear. The most effective law is followed out of hope, out of love, out of the willingness to obey, out of what yesterday we called consent. A good society is based on consent. It's not based on intimidation or some sort of top-down terror. So the trick for the effective lawgiver is to convince people that following the law is something they really ought to do of their own free will. Following the law is something that benefits them. It will, to use Spinoza's language, make them blessed. It will give them a sense of well-being, of flourishing, of achieving as much happiness as they can in this life. So his argument is that Moses' law, which covers everything one can do in life, from how you do business to how you get married, to how you work your fields if you're a farmer, to what you do in the morning when you get up and what you do in the morning when you go to sleep. The whole comprehensive law doesn't give you a chance to go your own way. Once you agree to it, it governs your whole life. And if you accept its premise, And Moses convinces the people to accept the premise. It makes you feel special. The Jews feel that they are chosen, specially loved by God, and they love God in return. But what does the special feeling of chosenness, of being a chosen people, what does that really come down to? It simply comes down to well-being in this world, living in a state that can protect you. That's all it is. And once the state is destroyed, there's no longer any reason to feel loyal, because it's failed to protect you. The state has failed. Part of Spinoza's argument in the book is against the Calvinist clergy in the Netherlands who are trying to turn the Dutch Republic into a theocracy. They're trying to have the government of the United Provinces run according to the law of the Hebrew Bible. It's part of a broad Christian movement called political Hebraism, Christian Hebraism, which comes out of the Renaissance. You see it already in Machiavelli, who writes very positively about Moses as a lawgiver and the strength of the society that Moses established, another purely political reading of the Torah. But Spinoza's arguing that the Bible is completely dysfunctional. It's to be totally rejected as the plan of a society. Why? Because although it worked for a while in antiquity, it was ultimately unsuccessful. Why was it unsuccessful? Because it didn't have enough coordination. It had different centers of power. There were prophets, there were priests, there were kings, there were elders. They were all fighting with each other. It was internally divided. And ultimately those internal divisions couldn't be held together, and the state didn't have enough strength to resist being conquered and to collapse. So it's not a theological reading at all of why ancient Jewish political life came to an end because God was angry with Israel for worshiping idols. No, it was a political analysis of what was wrong with their state, and Spinoza's point is that don't try this again. Don't try this today. The Bible is no kind of model for a good modern politics. On the other hand, the only thing the Bible is a model for our politics, but it's a failed politics. So again, this is a very strong reading of religion and politics. The Jewish religion is nothing but politics. If you want truth, you have to go elsewhere. And where you go is philosophy. Modern philosophy. That is Spinoza's philosophy. But that's another lecture. So I think you can see, I hope you can see some parallels between Maimonides' project of religion and politics and Spinoza's project of religion and politics. For Spinoza, amor Dei intellectualis, the intellectual love of God, is the highest happiness a human being can achieve. Very similar to Maimonides. Rather different understanding of God. However, I think you know, or may have heard, that for Spinoza, not in this book, but in his big philosophical work, The Ethics, which really has nothing to do with ethics, probably should have been called the Metaphysics, but anyway. For Spinoza, God is nature. Nature is God. It's the same thing viewed from two different points of view. And that is surely something Maimonides would reject. So very different metaphysics, but they really converge. And I could, if we had time to, for a course on Spinoza, I think you would leave here with 2 or 3 dozen deep similarities between Spinoza and Maimonides, but this is not that course. Okay, so we're just about out of time. Any questions at this point? Yeah, Alicia.
I have a question that is slightly related. Can you say a couple of words on what happened between Maimonides and Spinoza? We mentioned Abravanel as a one who can be seen as political philosopher. Are there any other
You mean
Jewish thinkers
thinkers
yes.
of stature between Maimonides and Spinoza?
Is there like 400 years between them? It's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, I think Joseph Albo is an important thinker. He's late 14th century. He has a lot to say, particularly about natural law, political law. He's a very interesting thinker. But Jewish philosophy goes out of fashion. Is Spinoza a Jewish philosopher? Spinoza is Jewish. He's a philosopher. He's one of the most important modern philosophers. I mean, Spinoza is interesting. You don't get to Spinoza without Descartes. Descartes, who's older than Spinoza, starts a revolution, and Spinoza's thought responds to problems in Descartes' thought. So you wouldn't have Spinoza if you didn't have Descartes. But people study Descartes nowadays, but mostly from a historical point of view. He's a great, important thinker. They study Spinoza from a historical point of view too, but they also use Spinoza as a kind of philosophical inspiration. I mean, there are a lot of Spinozists around. His thought is not dead. It's not just a historical antiquity. But is he a Jewish philosopher in some strong sense? He really doesn't like the Jews. There's an absolute absence, total privation of Ahavat Yisrael, of love of his people, Jewish people, in Spinoza. He's relentlessly critical of the Jews, and some of the most anti-Jewish intellectual elements of Kant, Hegel, German idealism, Marx, and others go back to Spinoza. Spinoza is a very important part of the story that we'll tell in the next few days. Very impactful philosopher. So should Jews keep him in Tehran and not accept him as part of the Jewish philosophical tradition? I think he should probably be in Tehran, but I think he should be part of the Jewish philosophical tradition. In part because of his closeness to thinkers like Maimonides. Yeah, he argues with them, but what philosopher doesn't argue with his predecessors?
But can we say that the Maimonides and Spinoza actually had the same start point? They deal with the question, namely, what to do after the fall of the temple. And they just give us a very different sort of answers.
Yes. I want to let people go because we're over time. But the answer is yeah, sure. And I think that's why he's a Jewish philosopher, because he's responding to Jewish problems. And at one point he says something very interesting, which is he says the Torah has emasculated the Jews. It's taken their masculinity away. Interesting thing to say. And if they ever can get beyond this, they may rise again as a people. And some Zionist thinkers take that piece and they see Spinoza as a proto-Zionist who preaches a renewal of the Jewish people by getting rid of their religion, which has emasculated them. So that sort of puts him within a modern Jewish story. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.